August 14th, 1889. She stepped off the train in Silver Ridge, Wyoming, expecting a new beginning, but instead found a crowd of disappointed faces and whispers of "not what we expected." The man who'd sent for her never showed up, leaving her stranded on the platform with nothing but a worn suitcase and tears streaming down her face. But when the town's wealthiest rancher, a man who'd sworn off marriage forever, saw her crying alone in the dust, something shifted in his chest. Could a woman deemed unwanted by an entire town become the only one he'd ever truly need? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steam from the locomotive hung in the dry Wyoming air like a veil between two worlds. Clara Whitmore gripped the handle of her battered leather suitcase, her knuckles white beneath her cotton gloves. Through the dissipating clouds, she caught her first glimpse of Silver Ridge, a collection of weathered wooden buildings clustered along a single dirt road. Surrounded by endless prairie that stretched toward distant mountains, this was supposed to be her fresh start. Her escape from the suffocating parlors of Boston, where she'd been passed over season after season, always too plain, too bookish, too much herself. The advertisement had seemed like Providence. Respectable gentleman rancher seeks educated bride for companionship and partnership in Wyoming territory. Must appreciate honest work and wide horizons. She'd responded immediately, pouring her heart into letters that traveled thousands of miles. Thomas Brennan had written back with words that made her believe someone finally saw her, not for what she lacked, but for what she offered. 3 months of correspondence had built a bridge of hope across the continental divide. Now, as she stepped onto the platform, that bridge began to crack. A small crowd had gathered, typical for train arrivals in towns this size, she supposed. But their faces told a story she hadn't expected. The woman's eyes moved over her brown traveling dress, her sensible boots, her unremarkable features framed by mouse-brown hair. She watched their expressions shift from curiosity to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "That's her," a woman's voice carried across the platform, not quite whispered. "Lord have mercy," Clara's cheeks burned. She lifted her chin and scanned the crowd for Thomas Brennan. He'd described himself in his letters, tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, usually wearing a black Stetson. She looked for that hat, that height, those kind eyes he'd promised. He wasn't there. "Miss Whitmore?" A thin man in a clerk's vest approached, twisting his cap in his hands. "I'm Herbert Mills from the post office. I have a—" "Well, there's been communication." Her stomach dropped. "Where is Mr. Brennan?" Herbert's Adam's apple bobbed. The crowd had grown silent, everyone listening. "He asked me to give you this." He thrust an envelope toward her, like it might burn his fingers. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was brief, the handwriting rushed, and nothing like the careful script of his previous correspondence. "Miss Whitmore, I regret that circumstances have changed. My previous housekeeper has returned to her position, and I find I no longer require a wife. Enclosed is money for your return passage to Boston. I apologize for any inconvenience. T. Brennan," the words blurred. $20 in bills fluttered from the envelope onto the platform. She stared at them, these thin pieces of paper that were supposed to erase 3 months of hope, supposed to send her back to the life she'd fled. "I'm terribly sorry, Miss," Herbert said, backing away as if rejection might be contagious. "The next eastbound train comes through on Friday. That's 3 days from now. The boarding house is just down the street, Mrs. Fletcher's place. She might have a room." He disappeared into the dispersing crowd before Clara could form words. She stood alone on the platform, the center of a tragedy she hadn't written but was somehow starring in. Through the gaps between departing townspeople, she caught fragments of their commentary, probably for the best. Can't imagine what Thomas was thinking. Plain as a fence post, that one. At least he had the decency to pay her way back. Clara's vision tunneled. The suitcase handle cut into her palm. The sun beat down on her head, making her black bonnet feel like an oven. She'd sold everything she owned to make this journey. The $20 might buy her a train ticket, but it wouldn't give her back her rented room in Boston, wouldn't restore the position as a governess she'd resigned, wouldn't undo the proud letter she'd sent to her aunt announcing her upcoming marriage. She had nothing to return to. And she had nothing here, the platform emptied. Even the station master had retreated to his office, leaving her alone with her humiliation. That's when the tears came, hot and furious and entirely beyond her control. They carved tracks through the dust that had settled on her face during the journey. She sank onto her suitcase, buried her face in her hands, and let herself break. Not delicately, not prettily, but with the raw grief of someone whose last thread of hope had just been cut. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She didn't care who might see. There was no dignity left to preserve. What she didn't know was that someone was watching. James Thornton had come to town for supplies, not entertainment. His ranch, the Double T, sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land north of Silver Ridge. At 34, he was the town's most successful rancher, its most eligible bachelor, and its most confirmed loner. He'd learned early that people wanted things from him, his money, his land, his name. Women especially. They came with batting eyelashes and calculated smiles, seeing not a man, but a prize to be won. He'd had his heart handed back to him once, years ago, by a woman who'd loved his wallet more than his soul. He'd sworn then, never again. So he kept to himself, ran his ranch with ruthless efficiency, and ignored the matchmaking attempts of every mother in 3 counties. He was content with his life, or at least that's what he told himself during the long evenings in his 2-empty ranch house. He'd been loading flour and coffee into his wagon when he heard the commotion at the train station. Train arrivals were usually worth watching. You never knew what news or goods might arrive. But this time, the murmuring crowd had a different quality. Curiosity pulled him toward the platform. He arrived in time to see the woman, young, simply dressed, utterly ordinary, standing with an opened letter in her hand and devastation written across her features. He recognized the scene immediately. Thomas Brennan's mail-order bride. The whole town had been gossiping about it for weeks. James had thought it foolish. Why import a stranger when Silver Ridge had plenty of local women? But Thomas had insisted he wanted someone educated, someone who could appreciate poetry and conversation. The town's response had been predictable: speculation, judgment, and now schadenfreude. James watched the crowd disperse, heard their cruel observations, saw the way they left her standing there like a piece of rejected merchandise. Something dark and angry stirred in his chest. He'd seen livestock treated with more consideration. He should leave. This wasn't his concern. Thomas Brennan's cowardice and the town's cruelty weren't his problems to solve. He had fences to mend and cattle to check, but then she sat down on her suitcase and began to cry. Not the delicate tears of women who cry for effect. James had seen plenty of those. These were the tears of someone whose world had just collapsed. Her whole body curved inward, like she was trying to make herself disappear. The sound of her sobbing carried across the empty platform, raw and unguarded. James's feet moved before his mind approved the decision. He crossed the dusty street, his boots loud on the wooden platform. She didn't look up, didn't seem to notice him at all. He stopped a respectful distance away, unsure what to do now that he'd come. "Miss," he said quietly. "Miss Whitmore." She jerked upright, frantically wiping at her face with her hands. Her eyes, red-rimmed and puffy, went wide when she saw him. He supposed he must cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, still dusty from the morning's work. "I apologize," she said, her voice thick. "I'll move. I didn't mean to—" "You're not in anyone's way," James interrupted. He removed his hat, a gesture his mother had drilled into him. "I'm James Thornton. I own the Double T ranch north of here." She stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Her face was blotchy from crying, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress wrinkled from travel. She looked nothing like the polished women who usually tried to catch his attention. She looked real. "I heard what happened," he continued, not quite sure where his words were leading. It's a shameful thing what Thomas did, leaving you stranded here. Her chin trembled, but she held his gaze. He changed his mind. That's his right, I suppose. Changing your mind is one thing. Not having the spine to face the consequences of that change is another. James surprised himself with the anger in his voice. A man should at least have the courage to speak to someone he's hurt. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, that anyone would defend her. I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Thornton, but I'll manage. There's a train on Friday, and until then? She looked away. The clerk mentioned a boarding house, Mrs. Fletcher's place. James knew it well, a grim establishment that rented rooms by the week to drifters and desperate men. That's no place for a woman alone. I don't believe I have much choice in the matter. The resignation in her voice struck him like a physical blow. This woman had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of promises that had crumbled to dust. She had every right to rage, to scream, to demand justice. Instead, she sat on her battered suitcase with the last shreds of her dignity gathered around her like armor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James made a decision that would change both their lives, though he didn't know it yet. "Come to the double T," he said. Her head snapped up. "I beg your pardon. I need a housekeeper. My previous one left 2 months ago to care for her sick mother in Denver. The place is falling apart without proper management." The lie came easily, smoothly. His house was fine. He'd been managing well enough with the help of his ranch hands' wives, who took turns bringing meals. "Mr. Thornton, I couldn't possibly. It's honest work for honest wages. Room and board included, plus $30 a month." He named a sum that made her eyes widen. It was twice what housekeepers typically earned, but something told him she was worth it. No expectations beyond keeping the house and preparing meals. "There are ranch hands around at all times. You'd be perfectly safe." She studied him with unexpected shrewdness, as if trying to discern his true motives. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" "Because someone should." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Because what happened to you today was wrong, and I won't stand by and watch the vultures circle." For a long moment she said nothing. He could see the war playing out behind her eyes, pride versus pragmatism, suspicion versus desperation. Finally she stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'll need to see the accommodations before I agree to anything." A smile tugged at James's mouth. Despite everything, she still had a fight in her. "Fair enough." "My wagon's across the street. We can be there by late afternoon." She picked up her suitcase. He reached for it, but she shook her head firmly. "I can manage my own belongings, Mr. Thornton." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and found himself meaning it. "I believe you can." As they walked toward his wagon, he noticed the faces in the windows lining Main Street. The whole town would be talking about this by supper time. James Thornton, the man who'd sworn off women, riding out of town with Thomas Brennan's rejected bride. Let them talk. For the first time in years, James didn't care what anyone thought. Clara settled onto the wagon seat beside him, her back straight despite her exhaustion. As they pulled away from Silver Ridge, she didn't look back at the town that had rejected her. She kept her eyes fixed forward, toward the open prairie, and whatever waited at the end of this unexpected road. James clicked his tongue at the horses, and they began the journey home. Neither spoke, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd just stepped off the edge of what they knew into something entirely uncertain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grassland. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, and on a dusty wagon rolling north, two lives that were never supposed to intersect began to intertwine in ways neither could predict. This was how it started. Not with romance, not with grand declarations, but with tears on a train platform and one man's unexpected kindness to a stranger nobody wanted. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings emerge from the most broken endings. The journey to the Double T took 3 hours, and Clara spent most of it studying the man beside her from the corner of her eye. James Thornton was nothing like Thomas Brennan's letters had painted him to be. Where Thomas had promised gentle poetry and refined conversation, James radiated quiet strength and practical competence. His hands on the reins were calloused and weathered. The hands of someone who worked his own land rather than merely owning it. He didn't attempt to fill the silence with empty chatter, which Clara appreciated more than he could know. Her mind was still reeling, caught between the morning's humiliation and the strange turn her afternoon had taken. She traveled 2,000 miles to marry one stranger, only to find herself employed by another within hours. The absurdity wasn't lost on her. The landscape shifted gradually as they traveled north. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, dotted with cattle bearing the Double T brand. Clara counted 3 different herds before she stopped keeping track. The ranch was clearly prosperous. The fences were well maintained, the cattle looked healthy and fat, and the few ranch hands they passed tipped their hats respectfully to James. "How long have you owned the Double T?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. "Built it from scratch over the past 12 years, James replied, his eyes never leaving the trail. "Started with 200 acres and 5 head of cattle. Now we're running close to 3,000 head across 15,000 acres. Clara did the mathematics in her head. "That's remarkable for 12 years. Hard work and good timing." He glanced at her. "And knowing when to take calculated risks." She wondered if hiring her counted as one of those risks. "You said your housekeeper left 2 months ago?" "Her mother took ill in Denver. Sarah felt obligated to go care for her." James shifted the reins. "She wrote last week saying her mother passed. She'll be staying in Denver with her sister. I'm sorry for your loss." Clara meant it. She'd seen enough death in Boston to know how it hollowed out the people left behind. Sarah was a good people. "The house hasn't been the same without her oversight." He paused. "The men have been taking turns bringing meals up from the bunkhouse, but it's not sustainable. We need proper management." Clara heard what he wasn't saying, that he was offering her more than charity, that this position genuinely needed filling. It eased something tight in her chest. She could tolerate pity if necessary, but she'd always preferred earning her way. The ranch house appeared over a rise, and Clara's breath caught. It wasn't the grand mansion she might have expected from a man of James's obvious wealth. Instead, it was a sprawling, single-story structure built from honey-colored wood and native stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Mountains rose in the distance behind it, their peaks still capped with snow despite the August heat. "It's beautiful," she said softly. James pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "It's practical. Built it to withstand Wyoming winters, which are nothing like what you're used to in Boston." He climbed down and came around to help her, but she'd already descended on her own. Gripping her suitcase, the front door opened, and a barrel-chested man with iron-gray hair stepped out. His eyes went immediately to Clara, then to James, his bushy eyebrows rising. "Boss," he said carefully, "wasn't expecting company. Frank, this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She'll be taking over as housekeeper." James's tone brooked no argument. "Miss Whitmore, this is Frank Morrison, my foreman. He runs the day-to-day operations." Frank's weathered face registered surprise, but he recovered quickly and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the Double T." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Clara straightened her spine. "I look forward to working with you." "Just Frank, ma'am. We don't stand on ceremony much out here." He looked at James. "The boys are going to have questions. They can ask them. Or they can mind their own business and do their jobs." James picked up Clara's suitcase before she could protest. "Come on, I'll show you the house." The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable leather furniture, and bookshelves lining 2 walls. Clara's eyes went immediately to the books, a collection that rivaled some of the private libraries she'd seen in Boston. She caught titles by Dickens, Melville, Shakespeare, even some newer works by Mark Twain. "You read," she said, then immediately felt foolish, stating the obvious. James set down her suitcase. "Winters are long. A man needs something to occupy his mind." He gestured down a hallway. "There are 4 bedrooms. The one at the end was Sarah's. It has its own entrance to the garden and catches the morning sun. I thought you might like it. Clara followed him through the house, her practiced eye cataloguing everything. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, though currently in disarray, with dirty dishes stacked on the counter. The bedrooms were simply furnished, but clean. The room he'd designated as hers was bright and airy, with a window overlooking what must have been a vegetable garden, now overgrown with weeds. It's more than adequate, she said, which was a vast understatement. The room was 3 times the size of her rented quarters in Boston. The root cellar is stocked, and Frank can bring up whatever you need from town. James stood in the doorway, suddenly awkward. Meals are typically at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. The men eat in the bunkhouse mostly, but I take my meals here. On Sundays, everyone eats together. Sarah used to make a big spread. Clara nodded, committing the details to memory. How many men? 8 full-time hands plus Frank and myself. Sometimes we bring in extra help during branding or roundup. I'll need to see the pantry inventory and understand what supplies need ordering. She was already mentally organizing her tasks. Work had always been her refuge, the one place where she knew her worth. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow's soon enough. You've had a long day. James backed toward the door. I'll have Frank bring up some water for washing. Supper will be ready around 6. Nothing fancy, just what the men brought up. Mr. Thornton, Clara called as he reached the hallway. He turned back. Why did you really hire me? The truth, please. He was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, refusing to be the first to break. Because I know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you, he finally said. And because you deserve better than what this town gave you today. He tipped his hat. Rest well, Miss Whitmore. After he left, Clara sank onto the bed and let herself feel the full weight of the day. She'd woken that morning on a train, full of anxious hope about meeting Thomas Brennan. She was ending it in a stranger's ranch house, employed by a man she'd met hours ago, in a territory she'd never imagined inhabiting. She should feel terrified, uncertain, lost. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Supper that evening was an awkward affair. Frank had brought up a pot of stew and fresh bread from the bunkhouse, and Clara insisted on serving, despite James's protests. The two of them sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. The stew's good, Clara offered. Buck makes it. He's our cook down at the bunkhouse. Former cavalry scout who can make anything taste decent, even trail rations. James tore off a piece of bread. He'll be relieved when you take over the kitchen. Says cooking for the men is beneath his dignity. Does he know I'm here? Frank's probably told the whole crew by now. James's mouth quirked. They'll be on their best behavior tomorrow, I guarantee it. We don't get many women out here. Clara set down her spoon. Mr. Thornton, I think we should establish some ground rules. For both our protection. He looked at her with renewed interest. I'm listening. First, I maintain my own quarters and my privacy within them. Second, all interactions between us remain professional and above reproach. Third, if either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable, we give 2 weeks' notice before terminating the employment. She met his eyes steadily. And fourth, the men need to understand that I'm staff, not entertainment. I won't tolerate any impropriety, James nodded slowly. Those are fair terms. I'll add a fifth. You're not a prisoner here. You're free to go into town whenever you need to, though I'd appreciate it if you let Frank or one of the men accompany you for safety. And a sixth, you'll take Sundays off. Everyone needs rest. I can work Sundays. No. His tone was firm but not unkind. I don't run that kind of operation. The men get Sundays to rest, worship if they're inclined, or do as they please. Same applies to you. Clara found herself nodding. Then we have an agreement. We do. James stood and extended his hand across the table. After a moment's hesitation, Clara took it. His grip was warm and solid, the handshake of someone who meant what they said. That night, lying in her new bed with moonlight streaming through the window. Clara listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming prairie. Coyotes howled in the distance. Wind whispered through the eaves. Somewhere the cattle lowed softly. She thought of the room she'd left in Boston, cramped and dark, where she'd heard only the sounds of the city, carriages, shouting, endless human noise. She thought of Thomas Brennan and his cowardly rejection, which had seemed like the end of everything just hours ago. Now, in this quiet room, in this unexpected place, she wondered if perhaps it had been a beginning instead. Clara woke before dawn, as was her habit. She dressed quickly in one of her simple work dresses and made her way to the kitchen. The house was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the main room. She lit the lamps and surveyed her new domain. The kitchen was indeed in disarray, but nothing she couldn't handle. She'd worked as a governess for 3 years, before answering Thomas's advertisement, and before that she'd helped run her late father's household after her mother's death. She knew her way around a kitchen and the management of a home. She started water heating for coffee and began exploring the pantry. Someone, probably Sarah, had organized it beautifully, with neat labels and logical arrangement. There were stores of flour, sugar, cornmeal, dried beans, preserved fruits, smoked meats, and an impressive array of spices. The root cellar, accessible through a trapdoor in the pantry floor, held potatoes, onions, carrots, and other vegetables that would keep through winter. Clara pulled out ingredients for biscuits and bacon, planning a hearty breakfast. She'd just gotten the biscuits in the oven when she heard boots on the porch. The front door opened and James appeared, clearly surprised to find her already working. "You're up early," he said. "I'm used to it. The family I worked for in Boston kept early hours." She poured him coffee without asking, having noticed the empty cup on the dining table from the night before. "Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. James accepted the coffee, wrapping both hands around the mug. His hair was still damp, suggesting he'd washed at the pump outside. "You didn't have to start today. I prefer to be useful." Clara turned back to the stove, checking the bacon. "Besides, I need to learn your routines and preferences." He settled into a chair at the kitchen table, a more intimate space than the formal dining room. "I'm not particular about food. Whatever you make will be fine. That's what men always say, but everyone has preferences." She glanced over her shoulder. "Do you like your bacon crispy or chewy?" "Crispy. Coffee strong or weak?" "Strong enough to stand a spoon in." "Eggs scrambled, fried, or boiled?" "Scrambled, usually. But I like variety." Clara smiled, filing away the information. "See, you do have preferences." They fell into a comfortable rhythm. James sat with his coffee while Clara worked, and gradually they began to talk. Not about anything heavy, just small observations about the ranch, the weather, the work that needed doing that day. It was remarkably easy, this casual conversation with a man she barely knew. When Frank and the ranch hands appeared for breakfast, they filed in quietly, clearly uncertain how to behave with a woman in the house. Clara served them efficiently, learning names and faces. Buck, the cook from the bunkhouse, was a grizzled man with kind eyes who looked relieved to hand over kitchen duties. There was young Tommy Garrett, barely 20, who blushed whenever Clara looked at him. Roberto Mendez, who spoke with a slight Spanish accent and had the most beautiful manners. Sam and Jacob Potter, brothers who finished each other's sentences. They were good men, Clara could tell. Rough around the edges, perhaps, but respectful and hard-working. By the time breakfast ended, and they filed out with their hats in their hands and thanks on their lips, she felt she'd passed some kind of test. "That went well," James said, after the last man had left. He'd stayed behind, helping her clear plates despite her protests. "The men like you. They don't know me yet. They know you can cook better than Buck, and that's enough for now." He stacked plates on the counter. "I have to ride out to check the north pasture today. Should be back by late afternoon. Frank's here if you need anything." "I'll be fine. I need to do a thorough inventory anyway, and that garden needs attention." She'd been eyeing the overgrown vegetable patch all morning. James paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, if I may thank you for giving this a chance." "Thank you for offering it, Mr. Thornton." "James," he said, "out here we use first names among friends." "We're friends, are we?" Clara raised an eyebrow. I'd like to think we might become them. He settled his hat on his head. Besides, calling each other Mr. and Miss all the time seems exhausting. After he left, Clara stood in the quiet kitchen and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. For the first time since leaving Boston, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she might be running toward something instead. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. There was a house to restore, a garden to reclaim, and a new life to build from the ashes of the old one. And if that life looked nothing like what she'd imagined when she stepped off the train in Silver Ridge, well, perhaps that was exactly as it should be. Sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never planned to reach. 3 weeks passed like water flowing downstream, steady, inevitable, transforming the landscape as it went. Clara threw herself into her work with the focused intensity of someone trying to prove her worth. Not just to James and the ranch hands, but to herself. The house responded to her attention like a garden after rain. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, organized the chaos in the kitchen, mended curtains that had been hanging torn for months. The vegetable garden became her personal project. Every afternoon after the noon meal was cleared, she'd spend 2 hours in the dirt, pulling weeds, coaxing the surviving plants back to health, planning what she'd plant next spring. The men noticed. Tommy Garrett appeared one afternoon with a basket of tomato seedlings from his mother's garden in town. Roberto brought herb cuttings from his own small plot near the bunkhouse. Even Gruff Buck contributed, showing her which wild plants growing near the creek were edible and which to avoid. But it was James's quiet observations that surprised her most. He'd ride in from checking cattle or mending fences and find small improvements, new handles on the kitchen drawers that had been sticking, the squeaky board on the porch mysteriously silenced, a rocking chair that had been stored in the barn now sitting in a shady corner of the porch. You don't have to do that, Clara told him one evening as she discovered he'd repaired the broken latch on the chicken coop. She'd been planning to ask Frank to fix it. James looked up from adjusting the mechanism, his hands black with grease. You're making this place feel like a home again. Least I can do is keep things functioning. That's what you pay Frank for. Frank's got enough to handle the cattle and the men. He tested the latch, satisfied with its smooth operation. Besides, I like working with my hands. Clears my head. Clara leaned against the fence watching him work. Over the past weeks, she'd learned to read his moods, when he needed silence, when he wanted conversation, when something was troubling him. Today, tension rode his shoulders like a physical weight. What happened? She asked quietly. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. Ran into Thomas Brennan in town this morning. He asked about you. Clara's stomach tightened. She'd successfully avoided thinking about Thomas, had pushed that humiliation into a locked room in her mind. What did you tell him? That you were well employed and none of his damn business. James's jaw tightened. He had the gall to suggest I was taking advantage of your vulnerable situation. Said I should send you back to Boston where you belong. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, part embarrassment, part fury. The audacity of that man. He abandons me on a train platform and then presumes to judge my choices. That's what I told him, in a slightly more colorful language. James finally looked at her, his grey eyes sharp with an anger that wasn't directed at her. He said the town's talking. That people are making assumptions about why you're here, what our arrangement really entails. There it was, the thing Clara had been dreading since accepting this position. In Boston, her reputation would have been in tatters. Here, apparently, it wasn't much better. Do you want me to leave? She kept her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. I won't have my presence damage your standing in the community, Clara. He said her name like a command, making her meet his eyes. I don't give a damn what they think, but I care what this might do to you. If you want to leave, if this becomes too difficult, where would I go? The words came out sharper than intended. Back to Boston where I have nothing? To another town where I'd be just as much a stranger? She straightened her spine. I'm staying. Let them talk. I know the truth of my situation and so do you. That's enough. Something shifted in James's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You're sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything." And as she said it, Clara realized it was true. In 3 weeks, this ranch had become more of a home than anywhere she'd lived in Boston. The work fulfilled her. The men respected her, and James, well, James was becoming something she didn't quite have words for yet. "Then we'll weather it together." He held out his hand, still dirty from the latch repair. After a moment, Clara took it, not caring about the grease that smudged her palm. The handshake was brief but solid, a renewal of the agreement they'd made that first night. As September arrived with cooler nights and golden afternoons, Clara discovered that weathering the storm meant facing it head-on. The confrontation came on a Saturday morning when Frank asked Clara to accompany him to town for the weekly supply run. She'd been avoiding Silver Ridge, sending lists and letting the men handle the purchasing. But the ranch needed fabric for new curtains, thread for mending, and several items she needed to see personally. The ride into town was pleasant enough, with Frank entertaining her with stories about the ranch's early days. But as they rolled down Main Street, Clara felt the weight of watching eyes. Women on the sidewalk stopped their conversations to stare. Men tipped their hats, but with expressions that ranged from pitying to speculative. At the general store, the owner, a thin woman named Margaret Davis, served Clara with tight-lipped efficiency. She measured out the fabric with sharp, precise movements, her silence pointed and deliberate. "Will that be all?" Margaret finally asked, her tone suggesting she hoped it would be. "I also need thread in these colors." Clara handed over a list she'd prepared, refusing to be cowed. Margaret's lips pursed tighter. As she gathered the thread, another woman entered the store, fashionably dressed, perhaps 30, with auburn hair artfully arranged beneath an expensive hat. She spotted Clara, and her eyes lit with malicious interest. Well, well, the mail-order bride who wasn't wanted. Her voice carried through the small store. "I hear you found alternative employment." Clara turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral despite her hammering heart. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Catherine Brennan. Thomas's sister." The woman's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I came to Silver Ridge specifically to meet you. Thomas told me all about the unfortunate misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding." Clara met Catherine's gaze directly. "Your brother changed his mind and lacked the courage to tell me to my face." "That's quite clear." Catherine's smile faltered for a second before strengthening. "My brother realized his mistake before making a more permanent one. You should be grateful he saved you both from an unsuitable match." "I am grateful," Clara said quietly. "Things worked out exactly as they should have, did they?" Catherine's eyes glittered. "Forgive me, but going from would-be wife to hired help seems like a significant step down. Though I suppose working for James Thornton has its compensations. He is the wealthiest man in the 3 counties, after all." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt her face flush, but before she could respond, Frank stepped forward from where he'd been examining harnesses. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "you should be careful what you're suggesting. Miss Whitmore is a respectable woman and an excellent housekeeper. Any insinuation otherwise is an insult not just to her, but to Mr. Thornton and every man on the Double T." Catherine's face hardened. "I'm merely stating what everyone's thinking. It's highly irregular for an unmarried woman to live alone with—" "She's not alone with anyone," Frank interrupted. "There are 10 men on that property, including myself. Everything's above board and proper. But I don't expect that'll stop you from spreading poison, seeing as you're related to a man who hasn't got the spine of a jellyfish." Catherine gasped. Margaret Davis looked up from her thread selection, her eyes wide. Several other customers had gathered near the door, drinking in every word. Clara touched Frank's arm gently. "It's all right. Mrs. Brennan is entitled to her opinions, however misinformed they might be." She turned back to Catherine. "I'm sorry your brother felt the need to justify his actions to you. I bear him no ill will. I hope he finds what he's looking for." She gathered her packages with as much dignity as she could muster and walked toward the door. Frank followed, his hand resting protectively on his gun belt, not threateningly but as a clear statement. They'd almost made it to the wagon when Catherine's voice carried from the store entrance. "You can play with respectability all you want, Miss Whitmore, but we all know what you really are, a desperate woman clinging to any man who'll have her." Clara froze. The words struck like physical blows, tearing open wounds she'd thought were healing. Her hands trembled as she clutched her packages. For a moment she was back on that train platform, alone and unwanted, the object of pity and scorn. Then Frank's gruff voice reached her. "Get in the wagon, miss. That woman's not worth your tears." But Clara wasn't crying. The trembling in her hands wasn't from sorrow, it was rage. She turned back to face Catherine, and something in her expression made the other woman take a step backward. "You're absolutely right. Mrs. Brennan, I am desperate to make an honest living, desperate to prove my worth through hard work, desperate to build a life on my own terms, rather than on the expectations of others." She took a step forward. "Your brother promised me a future and then discarded me like yesterday's newspaper. But instead of wallowing in that rejection, I found employment with a man who values competence over connections and character over gossip." She drew herself up to her full height. "So yes, I'm clinging to my dignity, to my self-respect, and to the belief that I deserve better than what your family offered. If that makes me desperate in your eyes, then I'll wear that label with pride." The small crowd that had gathered stood in stunned silence. Catherine's face had gone mottled red, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Clara didn't wait for a response. She climbed into the wagon with her head high, and Frank clicked the horses into motion. They were halfway home before Frank spoke. "That took guts, miss. Real guts." Clara's hands were still shaking in her lap. "I shouldn't have lost my temper. Sometimes losing your temper is exactly what's called for." Frank glanced at her. "That Catherine Brennan is poison in a pretty bottle. Always has been. Thought she'd have her hooks in James years ago, but he saw through her quick enough. She wanted to marry James." Clara felt something twist in her stomach that she didn't want to examine too closely. Half the women in the territory wanted to marry James at one point or another. "Still do," Frank chuckled. "But he's not the marrying kind. Saw too many marriages that were more about land and money than anything real. Swore he'd rather die alone than be some woman's meal ticket." Clara absorbed this information quietly. It explained a lot. James's distance from town society, his isolation, his initial wariness of her. "He must have thought I was just another fortune hunter when he hired me. Nah, James is a good judge of character. He knew what you were from that first moment. Someone who'd been dealt a raw hand and was trying to make the best of it." Frank paused. "He respects that. Hell, we all do." When they arrived back at the ranch, James was waiting on the porch. One look at Clara's face and his expression darkened. What happened? Frank filled him in with terse efficiency while Clara unpacked her supplies in the kitchen. She could hear James's voice rising, could picture the anger tightening his features. When Frank finished, there was a long silence. Then James appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I'm going to town." "Don't." Clara set down a bolt of fabric. "It'll only make things worse. Catherine Brennan doesn't get to treat you like that. She already did. Confronting her now won't change it." Clara moved to the stove, needing to do something with her hands. "I handled it, James. I spoke my piece and now it's done." "It's not done. The whole town will be talking about this by nightfall. Let them talk." Clara spun to face him, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I'm tired of caring what they think. I have work to do here, a purpose, respect from the men who matter. Why should I care about the opinions of people who judged me before they knew me?" James stared at her, and Clara watched something shift in his expression, surprise giving way to admiration. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're absolutely right." "Of course I am." Clara turned back to the stove, her heart racing. "Now get out of my kitchen. I have lunch to prepare, and you're in my way." She heard him chuckle, a rare, genuine sound that warmed something deep in her chest. "Yes, ma'am." After he left, Clara leaned against the counter and let out a shaky breath. She'd meant every word she'd said to Catherine Brennan. every declaration of independence to James. But the truth beneath those brave words was more complicated. She did care what people thought, especially one person. And that caring was becoming dangerous in ways she hadn't anticipated. That evening, after supper was cleared and the house had settled into quiet, Clara sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. She heard footsteps and looked up to find James approaching with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. "Thought you might need something stronger than tea after today," he said. Settling into the chair beside hers, Clara accepted the glass he poured for her. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, warming her from the inside. They sat in companionable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. "You were magnificent today," James said finally. "Frank told me what you said to Catherine. That woman's been the queen bee of Silver Ridge society for too long. Someone needed to put her in her place. I probably made an enemy for life. You made enemies before you ever spoke to her. At least now they know you have teeth." He took a sip of his whiskey. "Clara, I need to tell you something. But why I really hired you." Clara's heart skipped. "I thought we covered this." "Not all of it." James stared out at the darkening prairie. "When I saw you on that platform, crying like your heart was breaking, you reminded me of someone. Me 12 years ago, when I realized the woman I loved only wanted my money." He paused, the words clearly difficult. "Her name was Elizabeth Hartford. Boston society, just like you. She came west visiting relatives, and I fell hard. Thought she loved me. Then I overheard her telling her cousin that marrying a wealthy rancher was better than marrying a poor Boston gentleman at least the rancher could afford. To keep her in the style she deserved." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. I swore then I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Built walls higher than the Rockies." He finally looked at her. "But watching you refuse to be broken by what Thomas did, seeing you turn rejection into determination, you reminded me that not everyone's the same. Maybe my walls were keeping out the wrong things." "James, I'm not saying this expecting anything," he interrupted. "I just want you to know that hiring you wasn't charity. It was selfish. You made me remember what it's like to believe in people again." Clara didn't trust herself to speak. The vulnerability in his admission, the trust implicit in sharing his pain, it shifted something fundamental between them. They weren't just employers and employees anymore, weren't even just friends. They were 2 wounded people who'd somehow found each other in the vast wilderness of their loneliness. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for telling me. For trusting me with that." They finished their whiskey as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. And though neither spoke of it, both felt the foundation of something new being laid. Something neither quite understood yet, but both were beginning to hope might be worth the risk of opening those carefully guarded hearts. October arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that rattled the windows and wind that howled through the eaves like a living thing. Clara had never experienced weather like this, the sheer force of nature unleashed across the open prairie, with nothing to slow it down or soften its impact. The first real storm hit on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara had been hanging laundry when the sky darkened so quickly it seemed like someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The wind picked up, whipping her skirts around her legs and tearing sheets from the line. "Get inside!" Frank's shout barely carried over the rising gale. He appeared from the barn, already soaked despite the rain having just started. "This is going to be a bad one." Clara abandoned the laundry and ran for the house. By the time she reached the porch, rain was falling in sheets so thick she could barely see the barn. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the foundation. James burst through the door minutes later, water streaming from his hat and coat. "The cattle," he said, stripping off his wet gear. "We need to move the herd in the east pasture to higher ground. Flash floods can come up fast in weather like this." "You're going back out." Clara stared at him incredulously. Through the window, the world had become a grey blur of water and wind. "Have to. We'll lose half the herd if that creek overflows." He was already pulling on a fresh coat, checking his gear with practiced efficiency. Keep the coffee hot. We'll need it when we get back. James, Clara caught his arm. Be careful. He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face, and something softened in his expression. Always am. Then he was gone, back into the maelstrom. The next 4 hours were the longest of Clara's life. She kept the stove burning, coffee perpetually hot, and anxiety carefully buried beneath activity. She baked bread she didn't need, scrubbed floors that were already clean, and tried not to jump at every crack of thunder. Tommy Garrett stumbled in first, his young face pale with exhaustion. "Creek's rising fast," he gasped, accepting the coffee Clara thrust into his hands. "Boss sent me back to get more rope and lanterns. We've got cattle scattered across 3 miles, all spooked to hell. How bad is it?" "Bad enough." Tommy drained his coffee and grabbed the supplies. "Don't worry, miss. Boss knows what he's doing. Done this 100 times," but his reassurance rang hollow as he disappeared back into the storm. 2 more men came and went, each looking more haggard than the last. Clara fed them, gave them dry clothes when possible, sent them back out with hot food wrapped in oilcloth. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it grew worse as darkness fell. By midnight, only James, Frank, and Roberto hadn't returned. Clara stood at the window, watching lightning illuminate a world transformed by water and wind. Every instinct screamed at her to do something, but there was nothing to do but wait. She was startling awake in a chair by the fire, coffee gone cold in her hand, when the door finally opened. James staggered in, so covered in mud she barely recognized him. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead. Clara was on her feet instantly. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Cattle spooked and I got kicked." He swayed slightly and she caught his arm, shocked by how heavily he leaned on her. "Sit down before you fall down." She guided him to a chair, her heart hammering. "Where are Frank and Roberto?" "Right behind me. We got the cattle moved," but he winced as she began cleaning the wound. "Lost about 20 head to the flood. Could have been worse. Could have been better if you weren't so stubborn about risking your neck." Clara's hands trembled as she worked, fear transmuting into anger now that he was safe. "You could have been killed. That's the job, Clara." His eyes found hers. "Those cattle are my livelihood." "Our livelihood. Everyone who works here depends on them." The emphasis on "our" didn't escape her notice, but she was too focused on the angry cut to examine it closely. "This needs stitches, just butterfly it. I've had worse. I'm sure you have, which doesn't make this any better." She fetched her sewing kit, hands steadier now that she had a task. "This is going to hurt. Most things worth doing do." But he didn't flinch as she worked, his eyes never leaving her face. "You were worried about me. It wasn't a question." Clara focused on threading the needle through his skin with small, precise stitches. "I worry about everyone who works here." "That's not what I asked." She tied off the final stitch and sat back, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, I was worried about you specifically." Satisfied. A smile tugged at his mouth despite the pain. "Getting there." Frank and Roberto arrived then, both exhausted but uninjured. Clara fed all 3 men the stew she'd kept warming, listened to their recounting of the night's adventures. Cattle swept downstream, Roberto nearly losing his horse crossing the swollen creek. Frank's rope work that saved a calf, trapped in debris. By the time they finished eating, the storm had finally begun to break. The rain softened to a steady patter, and the wind dropped to a moan rather than a howl. The men headed to the bunkhouse for well-earned rest, but James lingered. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping things ready here. Made all the difference knowing we could come back to hot coffee and food. That's my job." Clara began clearing dishes, needing the distraction. "Clara," he caught her hand. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, and found his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. The walls he kept so carefully maintained had crumbled somewhere out in that storm. "It's not just your job anymore," he said. "Is it?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had dared voice until now. Clara could lie, could retreat into the safety of their professional arrangement. But the fear she'd felt tonight, the relief that flooded through her when he walked through that door, those weren't the feelings of an employee for an employer. "No," she whispered. It's not. James's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gesture achingly tender. I swore I wouldn't do this. Swore I'd keep my distance, protect us both from complications. He laughed, the sound raw. But somewhere between watching you bring this house back to life and seeing you stand up to Catherine Brennan with fire in your eyes, I forgot why I was keeping those walls up. Clara's heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. James, I'm not asking for anything, he interrupted. I just need you to know. Whatever this is between us, wherever it goes, I want you to have the choice. No pressure, no expectations, just honesty. The vulnerability in his admission took her breath away. This man who owned thousands of acres, who commanded respect from every hand on his ranch, who'd built an empire from nothing, he was offering her his heart with trembling hands. I came here expecting one future and found something completely different, Clara said slowly. I thought I knew what I wanted: security, respectability, a husband who appreciated my education. Thomas Brennan seemed like the answer to prayers I'd been praying for years. She squeezed James's hand. But he would have been the wrong answer, because what I really wanted, what I really needed, was someone who saw me. Not my deficits or my potential usefulness, but me. The me that loves getting dirt under her fingernails in the garden, that reads philosophy at night, that makes terrible jokes nobody laughs at. I laugh at your jokes, James protested. You laugh because they're terrible, not because they're funny, Clara smiled. But you laugh. And you fixed the squeaky board I complained about once in passing. And you remembered I like my tea with honey, not sugar. And you, her voice caught, you make me feel like being myself is not just acceptable, but valuable. It is valuable. You are valuable. James stood, pulling her up with him. They stood close enough that Clara could feel the heat radiating from him, despite his damp clothes. Clara Whitmore, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met. And if you're willing, I'd like to see where this might lead. No rushing, no assumptions, just possibility. Clara looked up at him, at this man who'd rescued her from the lowest moment of her life and somehow made her stronger for it. Tomorrow, she might worry about propriety, about what the town would say, about all the practical complications of what they were beginning. But tonight, with the storm breaking outside and something new beginning inside, she chose possibility. I'm willing, she said. James smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face into something boyish and beautiful. Good. That's good. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent electricity racing up her arm. Now I should let you sleep. It's been a long night. James? Clara called as he reached the door. Thank you. For being honest? For giving me the choice. Always, he promised. Always. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having washed the world clean. Clara woke earlier than usual, her mind spinning with the previous night's confession. What had changed exactly? Nothing and everything. She found James already in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee and failing spectacularly. I thought I'd let you sleep in, he said sheepishly, gesturing to the mess he'd made. Clearly that was a mistake. But Clara was smiling as she shooed him away from the stove. Go check on your cattle. I'll have breakfast ready when you return. The domestic scene felt different now, charged with new meaning. When James brushed past her to reach his hat, the brief contact sent awareness sparking through him. When their eyes met over the breakfast table, something warm and promising passed between them. The ranch hands noticed immediately. By noon, Clara had intercepted 3 knowing looks from Frank and a badly suppressed grin from Tommy. Even Buck emerged from the bunkhouse to study her with new interest, before nodding once, as if approving something. They know, Clara told James that evening as they walked to check the garden after supper. Of course they know. Men who spend that much time together develop a 6th sense for these things. James held aside a bramble so she could pass. Does it bother you? Should it? That's not an answer. Clara stopped walking and turned to face him. In the fading light, his features were soft, approachable in a way they rarely were during daylight hours. A month ago, I would have been mortified. Worried about my reputation, about what people might think. But I've learned something since coming here. What's that? That the opinions that matter are the ones from people who actually know you. Everyone else is just making noise. She reached for his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. The men here respect me because I've earned it through my work. If they're pleased that you and I are... She paused, searching for the right word. Courting, James supplied. Because that's what I'd like to call it if you're agreeable. Old-fashioned word, maybe, but I'm an old-fashioned man in some ways. Courting, Clara tested the word. Yes, if they're pleased we're courting, then I'm grateful for their blessing. And if Catherine Brennan and her ilk want to clutch their pearls, let them. I'm done living my life according to other people's rules. James laughed, the sound rich and warm. How did I get so lucky? Finding you on that platform was like... He shook his head. I keep trying to find the right words and they all sound inadequate. Like providence, Clara offered. Like the universe course-correcting, like two wrong turns that somehow made a right. Exactly that. He lifted her hand to his lips again, that gesture she was quickly coming to treasure. I meant what I said about not rushing. We'll take our time, do this properly. Properly by whose standards? Ours. James's smile was crooked. We'll write our own rules as we go. They stood in the garden Clara had reclaimed from wilderness, surrounded by plants that were slowly recovering under her care. It seemed appropriate somehow, this spot where she'd worked to nurture life back into something abandoned and overlooked. It reflected their journey, hers and James's, both of them learning to trust again, to risk again, to believe that maybe second chances were real. There's going to be resistance, Clara said quietly. Catherine won't let this go easily. And there will be others who disapprove. Let them. James's voice was firm. I built this ranch from nothing, Clara. Survived droughts and harsh winters and every hardship this territory could throw at me. I'll be damned if I'll let small-minded gossips dictate who I can care about. The casual mention of caring sent warmth flooding through her chest. They were really doing this. Stepping off the cliff of professional distance into the uncertain air of something more. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As they walked back to the house in the gathering darkness, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 4 months ago, she'd been in Boston, composing desperate letters to a stranger she hoped might provide escape from her suffocating life. 2 months ago, she'd stood on a train platform in Silver Ridge, rejected and alone, certain her life was over. Now she stood on the threshold of something she'd never dared dream of, not just security or respectability, but genuine partnership with someone who valued her for exactly who she was. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The town would talk, Catherine would scheme, and there would be obstacles they couldn't yet foresee. But as James held the door open for her and she saw the warmth in his eyes, Clara knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever storms came, they would weather them together. And that made all the difference. The first snow came in late October, transforming the ranch into something from a fairy tale. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching fat flakes drift down, coating everything in pristine white. She'd seen snow in Boston, of course, but never like this. Never so clean and vast, stretching unbroken to the horizon. Beautiful, isn't it? James's voice came from behind her, and she felt his presence like warmth at her back. I've never seen anything like it. She leaned slightly into him, the gesture still new enough to send a thrill through her. How do you manage the ranch in winter? Very carefully. His hand found hers. The next few months will be hard. We'll lose some cattle, always do. The key is preparation and vigilance. That, and having someone waiting with hot coffee when you come in half-frozen. Clara turned to face him, struck by how comfortable this had become, these casual touches, the easy companionship, the way he sought her out during quiet moments. 3 weeks since they'd acknowledged their feelings, and already she couldn't imagine the house without him in it. I should warn you, James continued, his expression turning serious. Winter means more time inside. The men get restless, tempers can run short, and we'll be more isolated. Snow can block the roads for days sometimes. Are you trying to scare me off? I'm trying to prepare you. There's a difference. He cupped her face with one calloused hand. I need you to understand what you're signing up for. Wyoming winters aren't Boston winters. I'm not made of spun sugar, James Thornton. I won't melt at the first hardship. She covered his hand with hers. Besides, I have incentive to stay warm. His laugh was low and intimate. Do you now? Before Clara could respond, boots stamped on the porch and Frank burst in, his face grim beneath a snow-covered hat. Boss, we've got trouble. Riders approaching from the south. Looks like Thomas Brennan and a half-dozen men. The warmth drained from the room. James's expression hardened into something Clara had never seen before. Cold, calculating, dangerous. How far out? 10 minutes, maybe less. Frank's hand rested on his gun belt. Want me to gather the boys? No, I'll handle this. James was already moving toward the door. Clara, stay inside. Like hell I will. Clara followed him onto the porch. If this is about me, I have a right to face it. James turned, clearly ready to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Fine, but you stay behind me, understood? They didn't have long to wait. 7 riders emerged from the snow like ghosts, Thomas Brennan at their head. He looked different from the coward who'd sent Clara that dismissive letter, harder, more confident with armed men at his back. Thornton, Thomas called out, reining in his horse 20 feet from the porch. We need to talk, then talk. You've got 5 minutes before I run you off my land. Thomas's eyes found Clara standing behind James, and something ugly twisted in his expression. I see the rumors are true. You've taken up with my intended, your intended. James's voice was dangerously quiet. The woman you abandoned on a train platform, the one you couldn't even face in person. That was intended? I made a mistake, Thomas said, and Clara was shocked to hear what sounded like genuine regret. I acted hastily, listened to the wrong people. I've come to make amends. He dismounted, and the men with him shifted in their saddles, not threateningly, but attentive. Clara recognized several from town, including Catherine's husband, Richard. Miss Whitmore, Thomas addressed her directly. I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable. I let my sister's prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process. I'm deeply sorry. Clara stepped forward, ignoring James's protective instinct. You're sorry. That's very noble, Mr. Brennan. Tell me, what prompted this sudden attack of conscience? The guilt you felt watching me struggle? Or perhaps the fact that James Thornton, the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, saw value where you saw none? Thomas flinched. I deserve that. I deserve worse. But my regret is genuine, Clara. May I call you Clara? No, you may not. Miss Whitmore, then. He took a step closer, and James moved to intercept. Thomas raised his hands placatingly. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to offer you what I should have offered from the start. Marriage, security, the position in society you deserve. The words fell into stunned silence. Even the snow seemed to pause in its falling. Clara stared at Thomas, at this man who'd crushed her hopes and now stood before her offering to rebuild them, and felt nothing but cold amazement at his audacity. You think I want that? Her voice was deadly calm. You think after everything I'd accept your proposal? I think you deserve better than being a housekeeper. Thomas's gaze flicked to James. No offense to Thornton, but you're an educated woman, Clara. You could be a rancher's wife. Have your own home, children, respect. Instead, you're valued, Clara interrupted. Appreciated. Treated with more dignity and respect in 3 months than you showed me in 3 months of letters, Mr. Brennan. Your offer is 2 months too late and built on entirely the wrong foundation. The wrong foundation. Catherine's voice cut through the snow. She'd ridden up behind the men bundled in expensive furs. The right foundation is marriage, not whatever sordid arrangement you have here. Catherine, Richard's voice held warning. We discussed this. No, let her speak. James's voice was ice. Let her reveal exactly what kind of poison she's been spreading. Catherine dismounted with practiced grace, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. The whole territory is talking, James. An unmarried woman living in your house, the 2 of you making eyes at each other. It's scandalous. You're ruining her reputation and your own. My reputation is my concern, Clara said firmly. And last I checked, you had no claim on either of us. I have a claim on decency. Catherine's face flushed beneath her fur hat. Thomas is offering you redemption. He's willing to overlook your indiscretions and make you an honest woman. Any sensible person would accept. Then I suppose I'm not sensible. Clara descended the porch steps, snow crunching beneath her boots. She walked directly to Thomas, close enough to see the surprise in his eyes. You want to know why I won't marry you, Mr. Brennan? It has nothing to do with anger or resentment, though I'd be entitled to both. She gestured back toward the house, toward James, standing on the porch with Frank now beside him. That man saw me at my lowest moment and offered help without conditions. He gave me work that challenged me, respect I'd never earned, and space to discover who I really am beyond society's expectations. He never once made me feel like I owed him anything beyond honest labor. Clara's voice strengthened. You're offering me position and respectability, the things I thought I wanted when I answered your advertisement. But James showed me I deserve more. I deserve partnership. I deserve someone who values my mind as much as my housekeeping skills, who laughs at my terrible jokes, who fixes squeaky floorboards because I mentioned them once in passing. Thomas's face had gone pale. You love him. The words hung in the frozen air, and Clara realized with startling clarity that they were true. When had affection become love? When had companionship transformed into something that shook the very foundations of her being? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but standing here in the snow, defending what they'd built together, the truth was undeniable. Yes, she said simply. I do. She heard James's sharp intake of breath, saw Catherine's triumphant expression crumble into fury, watched Thomas's shoulders sag in defeat. Then I've truly lost, Thomas said quietly, and I deserve to. Miss Whitmore, I won't trouble you again. For what it's worth, I hope you find the happiness I was too blind to offer you. He turned to remount, but Catherine caught his arm. You can't be serious. You're just going to let her choose poverty and scandal over what, Catherine? Thomas's voice was sharp. Over a marriage to a man who couldn't even be bothered to meet her at the train station. Over a husband who discarded her based on your prejudices. He pulled free of her grip. No, she's made her choice, and unlike me, she chose with courage. He swung into his saddle. The men with him looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Richard was actively avoiding his wife's furious gaze. This isn't over, Catherine hissed. The church won't condone this living arrangement. The town council will do nothing. James's voice cut through her threats like a blade. Because Clara and I are getting married. The world tilted. Clara spun to stare at James, who descended from the porch and now stood beside her. His face was set with determination, but his eyes held a question meant only for her. That is, he continued, gaze never leaving Clara's face. If she'll have me. I know this isn't romantic, proposing in front of an audience in a snowstorm. But I've wasted enough time protecting myself from feelings I couldn't control. Clara Whitmore, you walked into my life when I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone. You brought light to corners I'd forgotten were dark. You made me remember what it means to care about something beyond cattle and land. He took her hands in his, snow falling around them like a blessing. I can't promise you high society or fancy parties, but I can promise you honesty, partnership, and every day for the rest of my life, spent earning the love you just confessed. Will you marry me? Clara's heart was thunder in her chest. This wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal. No candlelight, no prepared speeches, no privacy. But it was perfect because it was them, honest, direct, witnessed by the land that had brought them together. Yes, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Yes, I'll marry you. James's smile was brighter than the sun reflecting off snow. He pulled her into his arms, and for a moment Clara forgot about their audience entirely. His embrace was warm and solid and real, the promise of every tomorrow she'd stopped believing in. When they finally broke apart, Catherine was already riding away, her fury evident in every line of her posture. Richard tipped his hat apologetically before following. Thomas lingered a moment longer, his expression unreadable. "Take care of her, Thornton," he called. "She deserves better than both of us gave her." "I intend to," James replied. As the riders disappeared into the snow, Frank let out a whoop from the porch. "About damn time, boss. The boys and I have been taking bets for weeks." The tension shattered into laughter. Roberto and Buck emerged from the barn, where they'd apparently been watching, both grinning widely. Tommy burst from the bunkhouse, nearly slipping in the snow in his excitement. "Congratulations, miss." "Boss," he was beaming. "Wait till I tell Ma. She's been hoping for this since you arrived." Clara found herself surrounded by rough men, offering surprisingly gentle congratulations, their genuine happiness warming her more effectively than any fire. These men had become her family, she realized. This ranch had become her home, and James had become her future. When the excitement finally died down and the men returned to their duties, James led Clara back inside. They stood in the kitchen, where so many of their conversations had happened, where the foundation of their relationship had been laid over coffee and honest words. "I'm sorry I proposed like that," James said. "You deserved roses and poetry, not a standoff in the snow." "I deserved honesty," Clara corrected, "which is exactly what you gave me. Although I notice you never actually asked if I wanted to get married before announcing it to Thomas and Catherine." James had the grace to look sheepish. "I may have gotten carried away. If you want time to think about it." Clara silenced him with a kiss, her first initiated contact beyond hand-holding. It was brief but electric, full of promise and possibility. When she pulled back, James looked dazed. "I don't need time to think," she said. "I know what I want. I want this, you, me, this life we're building. I want cold winter mornings and hot coffee, terrible jokes and squeaky floorboards, fixed in secret. I want to argue about cattle management and garden vegetables. I want everything you're offering and everything we'll discover together." James rested his forehead against hers, his arms circling her waist. "When? How soon?" "As soon as possible." Clara laughed at his surprise. "Why wait? We've already weathered more storms than most couples face in a lifetime. Let's make it official before Catherine can cause more trouble." Practical as always, but his smile was tender. "I'll ride to town tomorrow, speak to Reverend Matthews. We can be married by the end of the week if you're certain." "I've never been more certain of anything." That night, after supper was cleared and the house had settled into quiet, Clara sat at the desk in her room, soon to be their room, and began a letter to her aunt in Boston. She'd sent only brief notes since arriving in Wyoming, unable to explain the complicated truth of her situation. Now she had simpler news to share. "Dear Aunt Margaret, I write with unexpected but joyful news. I'm to be married this week to James Thornton, owner of the Double T Ranch, where I've been keeping house these past months. I know this will surprise you, as it surprised me. You asked in your last letter if I regretted answering that mail-order bride advertisement. I don't, though not for the reasons you might think. Coming to Wyoming was the bravest thing I ever did. It led me somewhere I never expected, not to the man I thought I was meeting, but to the man I was meant to find. James is nothing like the gentleman you tried to match me with in Boston. He's rough-spoken, works with his hands, and sometimes forgets to remove his boots before coming inside. He also makes me laugh, values my opinions, and treats me like a partner rather than an ornament. I'm happier than I've ever been, Aunt Margaret. The territory is harsh and beautiful, the work is hard, and I wouldn't trade it for all the ballrooms in Boston. With love, Clara." She sealed the letter, feeling the finality of it. This was her life now, not the one she'd planned, but the one she'd chosen. And that made all the difference. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white silence. But inside, warmth radiated from the stove and the promise of new beginnings. Clara extinguished her lamp and went to bed with a smile, dreaming of spring thaws and wedding vows, of challenges overcome and love discovered in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, she thought as sleep claimed her, the best stories start with rejection. Because only then do you learn what you're really made of and discover that what you thought you wanted was just the doorway to something infinitely better. James rode into Silver Ridge the next morning with Frank at his side, determined to arrange the wedding before Clara could be subjected to more of the town's judgment. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the world crystalline and bright, but his mood was darker than the weather suggested. "You sure about this, boss?" Frank asked as they approached the church. "Marriage is a big step. I've never been more sure of anything." James dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. "Clara's the best thing that's happened to me in years, maybe ever." Reverend Matthews was in his study, a slight man with kind eyes and silver hair. He looked up from his Bible when James knocked, surprise crossing his features. "James Thornton, I'd heard rumors you were courting the young woman from Boston, but I confess I didn't believe them. You've been so set against marriage." "I was set against the wrong kind of marriage." James removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Reverend, I'd like you to perform a ceremony this Saturday. Miss Whitmore and I wish to be wed." The Reverend set down his reading glasses. "This Saturday?"
That's 4 days away.
"Weddings typically require more planning, James. Banns to be posted, arrangements to be made. We don't need fanfare. Just legal vows before God and witnesses." James met the older man's gaze steadily. "Unless you have objections." Reverend Matthews studied him for a long moment. "I've heard talk about Miss Whitmore's living situation at your ranch. Some in the congregation have expressed concerns. Let me guess, Catherine Brennan led that charge." "Among others." The Reverend leaned back in his chair. "James, I'm not here to judge, but I do need to know. Is this marriage being entered into freely by both parties? Miss Whitmore isn't being coerced or pressured." "Clara has more backbone than half the men in this town," Frank interjected from the doorway. "If anything, she's the one who makes the boss straighten up and act right." Despite the tension, Reverend Matthews smiled. "I've heard she gave Catherine quite the dressing down at the general store. Margaret Davis couldn't stop talking about it." His expression sobered. "Very well. I'll perform the ceremony Saturday afternoon, but I'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore first, to ensure this is truly what she wants." "Fair enough." James stood. "We'll both be at the church tomorrow morning, if that suits you." As they left the church, Frank chuckled. "That went better than expected. Thought for sure the Reverend would put up more of a fight. He's a good man, more concerned with people's hearts than society's rules." James swung back into his saddle. "Now we need to stop at the jeweler's." "Jeweler's?" Frank's eyebrows rose. "Boss, I hate to break it to you, but Silver Ridge doesn't have a jeweler." "Then we ride to Cheyenne." "It's only 30 miles." James turned his horse east. "Clara deserves a proper ring, even if the wedding is simple." The ride to Cheyenne took most of the day, but James found what he was looking for, a simple gold band with a small sapphire, the blue reminding him of Clara's eyes when she laughed. It cost more than he'd planned to spend, but seeing it, he knew it was right. They returned to the ranch after dark to find Clara pacing the porch, despite the cold, worry etched across her features. When she saw them, relief flooded her face. "You were gone so long. I thought—" She caught herself, embarrassed by her concern, took a detour to Cheyenne. James dismounted, pulling a small velvet box from his coat pocket. "I realized I proposed without having a ring to offer. Seemed like poor planning." Clara's hands flew to her mouth as he opened the box, revealing the sapphire band. "James, it's beautiful." "But you didn't have to." "I wanted to." He took her left hand, suddenly nervous, despite having faced down Thomas Brennan without flinching. "May I?" She nodded, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the gold warm against her skin. Clara stared at it, tears gathering in her eyes. "I've never had anything this beautiful," she whispered. "Then you've been settling for far too little." James lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just above the ring. "Reverend Matthews will marry us Saturday afternoon. He wants to meet with you tomorrow to ensure you're certain about this." "Of course I'm certain." Clara looked up at him, the ring catching lamplight from the house. "But it's good that he cares enough to ask. Shows he takes his responsibility seriously." That night, the ranch hands organized an impromptu celebration in the bunkhouse. Buck produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. Tommy played harmonica with surprising skill, and Roberto taught Clara a Spanish dance that had everyone laughing at her attempts to follow the complicated steps. "You're going to be good for him," Frank told Clara during a quiet moment. "The boss, I mean. He's been alone too long, building walls so high he forgot what it was like to let someone in." "He let me in," Clara said softly, "because you didn't ask permission. You just started asking him whether he wanted you to or not." Frank smiled. "That's what he needed. Someone too stubborn to be kept at arm's length." The next morning, Clara and James rode to town together for her meeting with Reverend Matthews. The journey was easier than Clara's first trip to Silver Ridge. Now she knew the trail, understood the landscape, felt confident in the saddle. Everything had changed in 3 months. Silver Ridge looked different too, no longer the place of her rejection, but simply another western town, full of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Their judgment couldn't touch her anymore. Reverend Matthews received Clara in his study with gentle courtesy. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Please sit." Clara settled into the chair James had occupied the day before, her spine straight and hands folded in her lap, the picture of Boston propriety she could still project when necessary. "I'll be direct," the Reverend began. "I need to know this marriage is what you truly want, not simply what circumstances have forced upon you. James Thornton is a good man, but marriage should be a choice made freely, not out of desperation or obligation." "Reverend Matthews," Clara met his eyes steadily, "4 months ago, I made a desperate choice. I answered a mail-order bride advertisement from a man I'd never met, risking everything on promises written in letters. That was desperation." She leaned forward slightly. "This is different. James didn't rescue me. I rescued myself by accepting his offer of employment. We built a friendship based on mutual respect, discovered compatibility through shared experiences, and developed feelings that neither of us planned or expected. I'm marrying him because I love him, and because I can't imagine a better partner for the life I want to build." The Reverend nodded slowly. "You understand that marriage in a territory like this isn't easy? That ranching life is hard on women, especially those used to city comforts." "I understand better than most." Clara thought of frozen mornings hauling water, of bread baked before dawn, of gardens wrestled from stubborn soil. "I've been living that life for 3 months already. I know exactly what I'm choosing, and you love him truly." "With my whole heart." The words came easily, no hesitation, no doubt. "He makes me laugh. He challenges me to be better. He treats me like an equal partner, not a decoration or a servant. Yes, I love him truly." Reverend Matthews smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Then I'll be honored to perform your ceremony. Saturday at 2 o'clock? "Perfect." Clara stood, offering her hand. The Reverend shook it firmly, and Clara felt the final piece of respectability click into place. She had the church's blessing. Whatever Catherine or anyone else said now didn't matter. James was waiting outside, leaning against the hitching post with studied casualness that didn't hide his tension. When Clara emerged smiling, his shoulders relaxed. "All settled," she announced. "Saturday at 2. The Reverend approves. "Of course he does." James helped her mount her horse. "You could charm a grizzly bear if you set your mind to it." They were preparing to leave when a woman's voice called out, "Miss Whitmore, please wait." Clara turned to see a plump woman in her 50s, hurrying toward them, her face flushed with exertion. Behind her came 2 younger women and a man carrying bolts of fabric. "I'm Dorothy Fletcher from the boarding house," the woman puffed. "I heard you're getting married Saturday, and I simply couldn't let that happen without offering help. Every bride needs a proper dress." "Mrs. Fletcher, that's kind, but—" "No buts." Dorothy was already pulling out fabric samples. "I was a seamstress in St. Louis before coming here. It would be my pleasure to make you something beautiful. These are my daughters, Margaret and Susan, and my son, Henry." The younger women smiled warmly, no trace of the judgment Clara had faced on her arrival. "Please let us help," Margaret said. "Mama's been dying to make a wedding dress, and we want to make up for how rude some people have been. Clara looked at James, who shrugged with amusement. "I think you volunteered by the time Clara escaped Mrs. Fletcher's enthusiastic planning with promises to come by the boarding house." The next morning for measurements, half the town seemed to know about the wedding, and surprisingly, most reactions were positive. The baker offered to make a cake. The owner of the saloon promised to close early so his piano player could perform at the ceremony. Even Margaret Davis from the general store grudgingly offered flowers from her greenhouse. "I don't understand," Clara said as they rode home. "Last month they were judging me and now they're helping." "You stood up to Catherine Brennan," James explained. "That woman's been the terror of Silver Ridge society for years. Watching you put her in her place made you a hero to half the town. The other half respects that you're making an honest woman of yourself through marriage. Making an honest woman of myself." Clara's tone was dangerously sweet. "You mean by marrying the man I love, not by capitulating to small-minded gossip?" James grinned. "Exactly what I meant." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Fletcher and her daughters descended on the ranch to take measurements, bringing with them enough fabric and enthusiasm to outfit an entire wedding party. Buck and the ranch hands cleaned the bunkhouse until it gleamed, planning a reception there after the ceremony. Roberto disappeared into town and returned with mysterious packages he refused to reveal. James was everywhere and nowhere, handling ranch business while simultaneously ensuring everything was perfect for Saturday. He fixed the squeaky step on the church stairs without being asked, procured champagne from Cheyenne for the toast, and spent an entire evening polishing his late father's pocket watch until it shone. Clara found him the night before the wedding sitting on the porch, staring out at the mountains silvered by moonlight. She brought 2 cups of tea and settled beside him. "Having second thoughts?" she asked lightly. "Not even one." He accepted the tea gratefully. "Just thinking about my parents. They had a good marriage, real partnership, genuine affection. My father used to say he married his best friend. I never understood what he meant until now." Clara leaned against his shoulder, savoring the solid warmth of him. "I wish they could be here. They are, in a way. This ranch, this life, it's their legacy. And tomorrow, when I marry you, I'll be honoring the example they set." He set down his tea and turned to face her. "Clara, I need you to know something. Whatever happens, whether we have 50 years together or 50 days, loving you has made me a better man. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." The word hung between them, simple and profound. Clara took his face in her hands and kissed him softly, a promise of all the tomorrows they'd share. "Go to bed," she said when they parted. "Tomorrow's a big day and you need rest." "Yes, ma'am." But his smile was tender. "Sleep well, Clara. The next time we sit on this porch together, you'll be my wife." The thought sent shivers through her, anticipation, joy, and a touch of nervousness all mingled together. "I can't wait." Saturday dawned clear and cold, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. Clara woke early, her heart racing with excitement. Mrs. Fletcher arrived at dawn with her daughters, carrying the finished wedding dress wrapped in muslin. "You're not allowed to see it until you put it on," Dorothy announced, shooing James out of the house. Bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. The dress was simple but beautiful. Cream-colored wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, practical enough for ranch life, but elegant enough for a wedding. When Clara saw herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the plain, rejected mail-order bride. In her place stood someone confident, loved, ready to embrace her future. The church was packed when they arrived. Every ranch hand from the Double T had cleaned up and dressed in their best, forming a protective honor guard. Townspeople filled the pews, some out of genuine goodwill, others from curiosity, but all respectful. Catherine Brennan was conspicuously absent. Frank walked Clara down the aisle, in lieu of the father she'd lost years ago, his weathered hand steady on her arm. "You look beautiful, miss," he whispered. "The boss is a lucky man." But when Clara saw James waiting at the altar, she knew she was the lucky one. He stood tall in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed, his expression holding such love and wonder that her breath caught. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with quiet dignity, speaking of partnership and commitment, of love tested by hardship and strengthened by choice. When it came time for vows, James's voice was steady and sure. "Clara, I promise to be your partner in all things, to respect your mind, cherish your heart, and build a life with you based on honesty and trust. You've taught me that the strongest foundations aren't made of wealth or status, but of shared values and genuine connection. I vow to spend every day earning the faith you've placed in me." Clara's turn came, and she spoke from her heart. "James, you saw me at my lowest and offered dignity instead of pity. You've given me not just a home, but a purpose. I promise to stand beside you through whatever storms come, to be your partner in building this life we're creating together. I vow to love you not despite your flaws, but including them, because they're part of what makes you the man I love." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, James's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of all the passion they'd saved for privacy. The church erupted in applause and cheers, the sound washing over Clara like absolution. They emerged into bright sunshine, married, together, ready to face whatever came next. Rice flew through the air, and Clara laughed as it caught in her hair. James kept her hand firmly in his, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. The reception at the bunkhouse was raucous and joyful. Buck had outdone himself with the food, the champagne flowed freely, and at some point Roberto produced a guitar and led the crowd in singing. Clara danced with Frank, with Tommy, with every ranch hand who asked, but always returned to James, to the orbit they now shared. As the sun set and the party showed no signs of ending, James leaned close to Clara's ear. "Ready to escape?" She nodded, suddenly shy. They slipped away, while the crowd was distracted by Buck's storytelling, walking hand in hand to the main house, their house now truly and completely. Inside, James lit a fire, while Clara removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders. When he turned back to her, his expression held such tender intensity that her nervousness melted away. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, testing the name. "How does that sound?" "Like coming home," Clara replied. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. Their kiss was different now, no longer restrained by propriety or uncertainty, but free to express everything they'd held back. It was passion and promise, desire and devotion, all mingled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Clara Thornton. More than I knew it was possible to love someone. I love you too," she smiled. "Even though you still track mud through my clean kitchen." His laugh was warm and intimate. "Our kitchen now, and I promise to work on the mud." They stood by the fire as night deepened outside, wrapped in each other's arms, beginning the first night of a marriage that had been forged in rejection and built on respect. The ranch settled around them, cattle lowing in the distance, wind whispering through eaves, the eternal songs of the Wyoming prairie. Clara had come to this territory seeking security and found love instead. She'd been rejected by one man and chosen by another, who saw not what she lacked, but all she possessed. The journey from that train platform to this moment had been shorter in miles than in meaning, and as James led her toward their bedroom, Clara knew with absolute certainty that every hardship, every humiliation, every moment of doubt had been worth it. Because they had led her here, to this man, this life, this perfect, imperfect beginning. The best stories, she reflected, start with endings. Because only when one door closes can you discover the better door waiting to be opened. And behind this door was everything she'd never dared dream of finding. Winter settled over the double T with a fierce beauty that took Clara's breath away. Married life revealed itself in small, perfect moments. James reading aloud by the fire while she mended clothes, their hands finding each other across the breakfast table. The way he always saved the last cup of coffee for her. One February morning, Clara woke up feeling strange. Her stomach churned, and certain smells that never bothered her before made her nauseous. She dismissed it as something she'd eaten until the pattern continued for a week. When realization finally dawned, she sat at the kitchen table in stunned silence. A baby. She was carrying James's child. That evening she found him in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. "James, I need to tell you something." He looked up, concerned, immediately crossing his features. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The transformation in his expression, shock melting into wonder, then pure joy, was something Clara would remember forever. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of spun glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." The pregnancy progressed through spring and summer. Clara bloomed despite morning sickness and fatigue, her body changing in ways both miraculous and strange. The ranch hands became impossibly protective, treating her like precious cargo. In July, they rode into Silver Ridge for supplies. Clara's rounded belly was unmistakable now, and she braced for judgment. Instead, Dorothy Fletcher embraced her warmly. "Oh, my dear, when are you due?" "Early autumn, we think. I'll come stay at the ranch when your time comes. You'll need experienced hands." The town that had scorned Clara now celebrated her. Even Margaret Davis offered congratulations without her usual tight-lipped disapproval. But the encounter that mattered most came outside the general store. Catherine Brennan stood on the sidewalk, and for a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other. Then Catherine approached, her perfect composure cracking. "Mrs. Thornton, may I speak with you privately?" James tensed, but Clara nodded. Catherine led her a few steps away, then spoke quietly. "I owe you a real apology, not the half-hearted one I gave before. I was cruel to you because I was jealous. James refused to marry me years ago, and seeing you capture his heart so easily, it poisoned me against you." Clara studied the other woman, seeing genuine remorse for the first time. "Why tell me this now?" "Because carrying that bitterness is exhausting, and because you've shown me nothing but grace despite my treatment of you." Catherine's eyes shimmered. "You deserve better than my petty jealousy." "I'm truly sorry." Clara extended her hand. "I accept your apology. Let's put the past behind us." As they rode home, James pulled Clara close. "You didn't have to forgive her." "Yes, I did. I refused to let her poison take root in my heart. I have better things to focus on." She placed his hand on her belly, where their child moved restlessly. September arrived with cooler nights and golden afternoons. Clara was enormous now, moving with the careful grace of women in late pregnancy. On a crisp evening she was preparing supper when pain gripped her abdomen, sharp and unmistakable. "James," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think it's time." His face went white. "Now? But Dorothy's in town." "The roads, send someone for her. Meanwhile, you're going to help me to bed." The next hours were a blur of pain and effort. Dorothy arrived with two other women, just as Clara's labor intensified. They took over with calm efficiency, sending James out with firm instructions to stay away. He paced the main room like a caged animal, while Frank tried unsuccessfully to distract him. Every cry from the bedroom sent him lunging toward the door, only to be physically blocked by Buck. Dawn was breaking when a new cry joined Clara's, thin and strong and absolutely perfect. James burst through the door to find his wife propped against pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle. "Meet your daughter," Clara said softly. James approached on trembling legs. The baby was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and his grey eyes. Something fundamental shifted in his chest, reordering every priority he'd ever had. "She's perfect," he whispered. "What should we name her?" "I was thinking of Hope, after what she represents." James thought of everything they'd overcome to reach this moment. Clara's rejection, his walls, the gossip and judgment. Hope, it's perfect. He settled beside them on the bed, and Dorothy quietly ushered the other women out. In the quiet morning light, The three of them formed their own complete world. Spring came again to Wyoming, bringing new life to the prairie. Hope was 6 months old now, a happy baby who smiled at everyone and rarely cried. Clara sat on the porch one evening, watching James ride in from checking cattle, and felt contentment so profound it frightened her with its intensity. He bounded up the steps, kissing first Hope, then Clara. "Good day," checking the herds. "Everything's thriving. Someone else is thriving too." Clara smiled at their daughter, who was grabbing at James's finger with surprising strength. "She tried to crawl today. Won't be long before she's running all over the ranch." James settled beside them, and for a moment they simply existed together in perfect peace. The sun painted the mountains gold, cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its evening song. "Do you ever think about that day?" Clara asked suddenly. "The train platform?" "Every single day." James's arm tightened around her. "I think about how close I came to walking away. Then you started crying and I couldn't leave. Something pulled me toward you. Fate? Love recognizing itself before we knew what it was." He kissed her temple. "You changed everything, Clara. This ranch was just land and work before you. Now it's a home, a family. A legacy." Clara looked at Hope, already drowsing against her father's chest. "I came here expecting to be Thomas Brennan's wife. Quiet, respectable, probably miserable. And instead I became who I was always meant to be. Someone strong enough to build a life on my own terms. Someone brave enough to accept love when it appeared unexpectedly." She turned to face him. "You didn't rescue me, James. You gave me space to rescue myself. That's the greatest gift you could have given." "We rescued each other," James said firmly. "I was so closed off, so determined never to risk my heart again. You slipped past every defense I'd built and reminded me what living actually feels like." They sat together as stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, the house they'd built together waited, warm, welcoming, filled with the evidence of their shared life. Around them, the ranch stretched vast and beautiful, a kingdom they ruled together. Clara thought about the journey that brought her here, the desperate decision to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, the humiliation of rejection, the tears on that lonely platform. Every moment had led to this, to a life richer than anything she'd imagined in Boston's suffocating parlors. "I should write Thomas a thank you letter," she said suddenly. James laughed. "Thank him for abandoning you?" "Thank him for getting out of the way. If he'd married me, I would have spent my life being polite and bored and slowly dying inside. His rejection set me free to find this, you, Hope, this wild, beautiful life. That deserves gratitude. You're a better person than I am." "I still want to punch him," Clara smiled. "You're allowed your feelings. But I'm done being angry about what didn't happen. I'm too grateful for what I did." As darkness deepened, James carried their sleeping daughter inside, while Clara took one last look at the stars. The same stars that had watched her arrive broken were now witnessing her completeness. She traveled 2,000 miles expecting one future and discovered something infinitely better. Inside, James was settling Hope in her cradle, humming softly. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart so full it ached. This man who'd sworn off marriage, this life she never planned, this child they'd created together, it was everything she'd never dared dream of wanting. "Ready for bed?" James asked, catching her watching him. "Ready for everything," Clara replied. As they moved through their evening routine with practiced synchronization, Clara reflected on how far she'd come. The mail-order bride nobody wanted had become the woman everyone respected, but more importantly, she'd become the woman she respected. She'd learned that worth isn't determined by who chooses you, but by the choices you make for yourself. She chose work over self-pity. She chose courage over comfort. She chose love when it appeared in the most unexpected package. Climbing into bed beside James, feeling the solid warmth of him, hearing Hope's soft breathing from across the room, Clara felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," James replied, pulling her close. "Thank you for being brave enough to get on that train. Thank you for being there when I stepped off it. Always. Clara, I'll always be there. In the quiet of their Wyoming ranch, surrounded by the life they'd built from rejection's ashes, Clara Thornton fell asleep knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as disasters. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you truly need. Clara had been rejected by the wrong man, found by the right one, and transformed by her own courage. The journey from that train platform to this moment had been shorter in miles than in meaning. But every tear shed, every humiliation endured, every moment of doubt had been necessary because they'd led her here to love, to home, to a life more beautiful than anything she dared imagine. And that was the greatest gift of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.